She had been told it was just a house. That was the exact phrasing the employment agency had used when they called her on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. While she was sitting at the edge of a hospital bed, holding her daughter's small hand and watching the IV drip count seconds like a metronome measuring everything, she stood to lose. "It's just a house," the woman from the agency had said, her voice brisk and businesslike, carrying the particular cheerfulness of someone whose child was not sick, whose rent was not 3 months overdue, whose hands were not shaking. Large estate, Ridgewood area, 1 employer, a few additional staff. Standard domestic work. The pay is exceptional. The Nadia Ose had written down the address on the back of a hospital receipt and whispered thank you so many times it must have sounded like a prayer. She told herself the trembling in her hands was exhaustion. She told herself the way she hesitated at the front gates. Those towering iron gates with the letter V worked into their scrollwork like a brand. Was simply nerves. New job, new place. She was 31 years old and she had survived worse than a job interview at a rich person's house. She had survived far worse. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted the strap of her bag, and pressed the buzzer. She was not prepared for what waited on the other side. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a compact woman in her late 50s named Mrs. Prudence Adiemi, whose handshake felt like a quiet test of character. She had silver, streaked natural hair pulled back from a face that had clearly once been beautiful and was now something better. Formidable. She looked at Nadia the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, reading something that the patient cannot see. "You're the one from the agency," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am. Nadia Ose." "You have references." 3. All verifiable. Nadia held out the envelope. "And my daughter's medical documents, in case the employer needs confirmation of my—" "Your daughter is sick." The word sick landed in Nadia's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she worked to suppress. "She has a kidney condition. Managed. She's stable right now. But the medical expenses are significant. I need consistent work." And Mrs. Adiemi regarded her for a long moment. Something in the older woman's face shifted, just slightly, not softened exactly, but recalibrated the way a compass needle finds north. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you the house." The house was not just a house. It was the kind of residence that announced its wealth not through excess but through restraint. Every surface curated. Every object chosen with the cold precision of someone who had never needed to compromise. The foyer alone was larger than Nadia's entire apartment. Black marble floors reflected the chandelier light in a way that made you feel you were walking on dark water. The walls held original art. She recognized a Ghanaian landscape painting, a Lagos street scene, a series of abstract canvases in deep burgundy and gold that seemed to breathe. Mrs. Adiemi walked her through the ground floor with military efficiency. The kitchen, commercial grade, immaculate. The formal dining room, rarely used. The library, she paused there, one finger hovering near the doorframe. "Mr. Vance uses this room in the evenings. You'll clean it in the mornings only. Never after 6. Nadia nodded, committing each instruction to memory. "The upper floors are residential. You'll have a room on the 3rd floor, adjacent to the east wing. Mr. Vance occupies the master suite. His son's room is—" Mrs. Adiemi stopped walking. She turned, and for a fraction of a second, a composure showed a hairline fracture. "His son is 7. His name is Elias. He is particular. He doesn't speak much to new people." "That's all right," Nadia said. "I'm patient." Mrs. Adiemi studied her again. "You'll need to be." They moved through a wide corridor that connected the main house to what appeared to be a formal sitting room, the kind of room designed to intimidate visitors rather than comfort them. Nadia noticed the fireplace. The leather chairs arranged with geometric precision, the side table with a crystal decanter catching October light. And then she noticed the portrait. It was hung above the fireplace, as portraits in houses like this always were. The position of unquestioned authority, the visual anchor of the room, the thing your eyes went to before anything else. It was oil on canvas, large, perhaps 4 feet by 5, in a gilded frame that was elegant without being ostentatious. The subject was a man, mid-30s, perhaps with a broad, composed face and dark eyes that held a quality she couldn't immediately name. Intelligence, yes. Control, certainly. But beneath those things, something older and quieter. Something that looked like grief that had been professionally managed, but never entirely resolved. She knew those eyes. The thought arrived before the recognition did, landing in her body first. A sudden cold certainty in her sternum. A tightening in her throat. A rushing in her ears. She knew those eyes the way you know the smell of a particular season, the way you know a voice in the dark. She knew them because she had looked at them across a hotel bar in Accra 5 years ago. Because they had looked back at her with an attention that felt, at the time, like being chosen. Because she had spent 8 months watching those eyes soften over candlelight and crinkle with laughter and shadow with something she had, in her worst and most vulnerable moments, convinced herself might be love. She knew those eyes because her daughter had inherited them. Nadia did not faint. She did not cry. She did not make any sound at all. She stood very still in the doorway of the sitting room of the estate belonging to a man named Vance, while her entire understanding of the past 5 years reorganized itself around a single portrait. And she performed the most difficult act of her adult life. She kept her face completely, professionally, devastatingly blank. "That's Mrs. Adayemi said, watching her. "I see," Nadia said. Her voice was perfect. She hated herself for it. His name, she learned from the orientation documents, was Dominic Vance, 42 years old. CEO of Vance Capital, one of the largest private equity firms in West Africa with significant holdings in Europe and the United States. Widower, his wife, a woman named Simone Vance Nane Laurent, had died 3 years ago in a car accident, leaving behind a young son and a legacy that seemed to still vibrate through the walls of this house like a held note. The documents were thorough household protocols, privacy expectations, scheduling preferences, emergency contacts. They described a man who valued discretion above almost everything else. He was described in the agency materials as demanding but fair, private, rarely home before 7 in the evening. What the materials did not describe, what no materials could, was the way that 5 years had sharpened him. When she finally saw him in person on her 3rd day, Nadia understood immediately that the portrait had been painted before something significant had happened to Dominic Vance. The man descending the staircase at 6:40, 7 in the evening, jacket in one hand, phone pressed to his ear, was harder somehow, carved down to essentials. Still handsome in the way that certain landscapes are beautiful. Not comfortably, not invitingly, but with a severity that made you catch your breath. He walked through the foyer without looking up from his phone. She was holding a folded stack of clean linens and pressing herself close to the wall in the practiced way of good domestic staff. Present but invisible, available but not obtruding. He passed within 4 feet of her. He did not see her. She was the new maid. She was part of the architecture. In Accra, he had told her she had the kind of face that stayed with a person. Of course he didn't. She was the new maid. She was part of the architecture. Nadia stood absolutely still until the sound of his office door closing reached her, and then she let out a breath she had been holding since Monday and carried the linens to the upstairs closet on legs that felt made of unreliable material. In the small bathroom adjacent to her room, she ran the cold tap and pressed her wrists under it until the world stabilized. She looked at her own face in the mirror, the face he hadn't recognized, the face that had aged 5 years and navigated an ocean of difficulty in the time since he'd last seen it. She thought about Amara. Her daughter was 6 years old and had her mother's stubbornness and her father's eyes, and no idea that her father existed in the same city, in the same country, under the same impossible sky. Amara believed, because Nadia had told her with the careful gentleness of someone managing a wound, that her father was a man who hadn't been able to stay. Not a lie, more of an amputated truth. A truth that had been cut to its least damaging length. Nadia had not come here because of him. She needed to hold on to that. She had taken this job because Amara needed a specialist at Lagos University, teaching hospital who didn't accept public insurance. Because the rent on their apartment had just increased by 40%. Because the 3 other jobs she'd applied to that month had not called back. She had taken this job because she was desperate and the pay was extraordinary, and she had told herself, rationally, that the chances of the employer being the same man were vanishingly small, that she was being paranoid, that coincidences of that magnitude did not happen to people like her. She had been wrong. She was here now, and she had 2 choices: leave or stay. If she left, Amara went without her specialist appointment in 6 weeks. Nadia pressed her wrists under the cold water a moment longer and decided. She met Elias on her 5th morning. He was sitting at the kitchen table when she arrived at 6:30 to begin breakfast preparations, which was unusual enough. Mrs. Adeyemi had told her the boy rarely appeared before 8. He was a small 7-year-old, slim and watchful, with his father's dark complexion and his mother's pointed chin. Wearing pajamas printed with rocket ships and regarding a bowl of cereal with the philosophical suspicion of someone who has been disappointed before. He did not look up when she entered. "Good morning," Nadia said, moving to the counter and beginning the coffee preparation with the focus of someone determined to be nothing but professional. Silence. "I'm Nadia. I started working here this week." She glanced at him. "You're Elias!" He looked up then. His eyes were his father's, dark and watchful, but where Dominic Vance's gaze carried weight and command, Elias's carried something more undefended, more curious. He examined her with the frank assessment of childhood, the kind that hasn't yet learned to be polite about its scrutiny. "Oh, Mrs. Adeyemi said you have a daughter," he said. His voice was gravelly for his size, like he'd swallowed small stones. Nadia paused in her coffee, measuring. "She did. She tells me about new people before they come, so I'm not surprised." He looked back at his cereal. "She says being surprised is bad for my concentration." "That's remarkably practical." "I'm practically minded." He said it without arrogance, as a statement of neutral fact. "As your daughter's sick." Then Nadia set the coffee scoop down carefully. "She has a kidney condition. Is doing well right now. My mom died." He said this with the same neutral gravity. 3 years ago. "I know. I'm sorry." People always say sorry, but they don't know what to do with their face when they say it. "You don't do that." She found herself looking at him fully. "I lost my mother when I was 9, she said. "I know what it feels like to have people make sorry faces at you." Elias considered this. Something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. A fraction of an inch of loosening in his shoulders, a slight unclenching around his jaw. He looked at her with the same watchfulness, but the quality of it had changed. He was no longer reading a stranger. He was reading someone who might be legible. "She used to sit with me when I couldn't sleep," he said.
Mrs.
Adeyemi tries, but she falls asleep herself. "What did your mother do when she sat with you?" "She told me about the stars. She knew all the names." He paused. "Dad tried once. He doesn't know the stars. He knows stocks and markets. A beat. He tell us you're the addition. He tries to, was so small and so devastating that Nadia had to turn back to the coffee machine so the boy wouldn't see her face. She spent the rest of the morning moving through her work, with the careful precision of someone navigating a floor that might not hold. She cleaned the library. Dark wood, tall shelves, the smell of paper and something smokier underneath. She dusted the sitting room without looking at the portrait. She was good at not looking at things. She had developed this skill over 5 years of not looking at the empty chair across her kitchen table, not looking at the part of her phone where his number used to be, not looking at the particular dark, honey brown of her daughter's eyes when they caught the light in a certain way. On her way out of the sitting room, she looked at the portrait. It held her gaze the way certain pieces of music do. Against your will, against your better judgment, with a kind of authority that isn't asking permission. She stood in front of it for a full 30 seconds, which felt much longer, long enough for the whole shape of her grief to reassemble itself in her chest. Because that was what this was, underneath the terror and the logistics and the calculated survival. Grief. Grief for the version of herself who had believed that the way he looked at her meant something durable. She had been 26 when they met. He had been in Accra for a conference. She had been working the hotel bar, putting herself through a postgraduate degree in hotel management, saving money to send to her mother's medical care back home in Lagos. He had been the kind of man who sat at bars alone, not because he was lonely, but because he preferred his own company. She had recognized that in him immediately. That quality of chosen solitude, and they had started talking about a book she'd been reading on her break. Just that. A book. And then another drink. And then a walk along the waterfront in the warm night air. And then 8 months. 8 months of him flying between Lagos and Accra, of phone calls that went late into the night, of a relationship that existed in the suspended time of hotel rooms and airport arrivals, never quite landing in ordinary life. And then his wife had contacted her. She hadn't known he was married. That was the thing she had told herself at the time, the thing she still told herself because it was true. She hadn't known because he had been meticulous about it. No ring. No photos in his wallet, no calls taken in front of her that couldn't be explained as business. She had known he was a private man, a controlled man, a man who kept parts of himself sealed away like climate-controlled rooms. She had attributed this to personality rather than strategy. Then Simone Vance had called her cell phone on a Sunday evening and spoken to her in the flat. Exhausted voice of a woman who had done this before. Traced a number, made a call, said the necessary things. A wife, a son, a pattern. Apparently, though she used more diplomatic phrasing. She had not been cruel. She had been the particular kind of tired that lives past anger. Nadia had ended the call and sat on the edge of her bed in Accra and felt the floor of her understanding drop away. She had called him. He hadn't answered. She had called again. He had answered and spoken carefully, in the modulated tones of a man managing a situation, and somewhere in the first 30 seconds she had understood that the careful tones were the confession. Not what he said. How he said it had told him she was done. She had meant it. She had not yet known about Amara. She learned about Amara 6 weeks later. She was back in Lagos by then, her mother's health declining, her degree program on pause. She sat in a clinic waiting room for 2 hours, and then a doctor she barely knew told her she was 8 weeks pregnant, and she had the strange, disoriented experience of receiving news that is simultaneously catastrophic and miraculous, and entirely beyond the scope of anything she had planned. She thought about telling him. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She drafted messages that she deleted. She considered the mathematics of it from every angle. What he owed her, what she was entitled to, what kind of life her child deserved. what kind of man he was beneath the thing he had done. She thought about Simone Vance's tired voice on the phone. She thought about Elias, who had been 4 years old at the time and had nothing to do with any of it. She decided not to tell him. It was not a clean decision. It was the kind of decision you make when every available option is wrong, and you choose the one that seems least corrosive. The one you can live with, that your child can live with, that won't require explanations you can't yet imagine having to give. She had told Amara's story as she'd told it a man who couldn't stay. She had built a life in the space his absence had left, and she had been, if not happy, then sufficiently resilient that happiness seemed occasionally possible. And now she was cleaning his library, and not looking at his portrait, and sleeping in a room 30 feet from his son, and 15 years of everything she'd suppressed was climbing her throat like a tide. She saw him properly on her 8th day. He came home earlier than usual. She heard the car before 5 o'clock, and had just enough time to register the sound before he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had the particular look of a man who has spent the day losing a battle he doesn't yet want to concede. The jacket still on, the tie still knotted, but something behind the eyes too close to the surface. She was dicing vegetables for the evening meal. Mrs. Adami had taken Elias to a music lesson. He stopped in the doorway. "You're the new," he started. "Nadia Osi. I started last week." She didn't look up from the cutting board. "Mrs. Ademi should be back by 6. Can I get you something?" "Coffee," he said. After a pause, she made the coffee. She could feel him in the room the way you feel weather. A pressure change, a shift in the quality of the air. He sat at the kitchen island, and she set the cup in front of him and turned back to the vegetables and waited for the recognition that never came. He did not know her. She had spent 8 days dreading this moment, and what she found, now that it was happening, was something worse than the fear. She found that she was invisible to him. Not maliciously, not deliberately. Simply invisible in the way that the new maid is invisible, that domestic staff are invisible in houses like this. She had moved through his home for a week, and he had passed her twice in corridors and not registered her as a person he had ever met. In Accra, he had told her she had the kind of face that stayed with a person. "My son home?" he asked. "Music lesson with Mrs. Ademi. Back at 6. He drank his coffee in the particular silence of a man who has forgotten how to simply sit. She watched him from the corner of her eye, the way she watched things she needed to understand. The way you watch weather to predict it. The way you watch a wound to gauge it. He was looking at the counter. Not at anything on it. Through it, maybe. "You're from Lagos originally?" he asked. She paused on the cutting board. "Yes, sir." "Which area?" "Yoba." "A beat." "I know Yoba." He said it with something that might have been nostalgia if he were the kind of man who permitted himself that. "I went to school near there. Long time ago." "Is that right?" she said, in the neutral tone that was becoming her primary mode of communication in this house. He left the kitchen a few minutes later, and she stood in the echo of his absence and listened to the sound of her own breathing and thought. He genuinely does not remember me. And then, because she had become ruthlessly honest with herself in the past 5 years, why would he? She had been one of several. She had known that. After Simone's phone call, in the cold way you know something that your body has been trying not to absorb. She had been a hotel bar and 8 months, and then a number in a phone. She had been managed. She pushed the thought away and finished the vegetables and set the table and did not cry. She was very good at not crying. The recognition, when it came, arrived through the most indirect possible route. It was Elias. She had been there 3 weeks when it happened. 3 weeks of navigating the house, and the man and the portrait and the slow, terrifying sweetness of watching a small boy gradually decide that she was trustworthy. Elias had thawed by increments, with the methodical caution of a child who had learned that warmth was something that could be withdrawn without warning. He had started lingering in the kitchen when she worked, then asking questions. Then, one evening when his father was late and Mrs. Adeyemi was on the phone with her sister, sitting beside her on the back terrace and looking up at a sky scattered with early stars. "That one's Orion," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You know the stars?" "Some of them. My grandmother taught me." She found Cassiopeia, then the Pleiades. "Your mother knew more, I think." "How do you know what my mother knew?" The question was quick and guileless, without any accusation in it. Just the direct inquiry of a child who has no reason to expect a complicated answer. Nadia heard herself and recalibrated. "I just meant, mothers usually do. It's the kind of thing mothers know." He accepted this. They sat in silence for a while, and Nadia watched him watching the stars with an expression that was too old for his face. A kind of patient enduring that had been learned too early. She felt the complicated pressure in her chest that she associated with Amara. The love that was also fear, the tenderness that contained the knowledge of everything that could be lost. "Can I show you a picture?" she asked, before she had consciously decided to. He looked at her. She pulled out her phone and found a photo of Amara, a recent one, from the hospital visit a month ago. Amara sitting in a hospital bed with her IV line and her braids coming loose, and the expression she made when she was trying to seem braver than she felt, which was so specific and so particular that Nadia felt the usual clench of love and anguish looking at it. Elias took the phone and looked at the photo for a long time. "She looks like me," he said finally. It was so unexpected and so precisely accurate that Nadia felt her carefully constructed composure list dangerously to one side. "What do you mean?" He was still looking at the photo. "Her eyes, they look like my eyes. Like Dad's eyes." He tilted the phone toward her and pointed with a 7-year-old's complete absence of subtext. "See, the shape." "Lots of people have dark eyes," Nadia said carefully. "No, but the shape." He was genuinely interested. The intellectual precision that she'd noticed in him fully engaged now. "Mrs. Adeyemi says eye shapes run in families. She said I have my dad's exact eyes and his dad's before that." He handed the phone back. "Your daughter has them too." "That's interesting." And Nadia put her phone away with fingers that were not quite steady. "Yes," she said. "It is interesting." They sat for another few minutes before Dominic's car came through the gates, and Nadia used the approach of headlights as an excuse to gather herself. Gathering herself being a skill she had been refining for years, the ability to collect her exposed places and put them somewhere inaccessible quickly before anyone could reach them. That night, in her room on the 3rd floor, she lay awake and understood that she could not stay here indefinitely. But she could not leave yet either. Amara's appointment was in 3 weeks. The money she'd saved in this month alone was already more than she'd managed in the previous 3 months combined. She needed 6 more weeks. 8 to be safe. She told herself 8 weeks. 8 weeks, and then she would have enough saved to bridge the gap, to find another position, to explain to the agency that the placement hadn't worked out without anyone needing to understand why. 8 weeks. 40 minutes later she was still awake, and she could hear, from somewhere on the floor below, the muffled sound of piano music. Something slow and searching, played without great technical skill, but with an unmistakable quality of feeling. She had not known he played. She lay in the dark and listened to Dominic Vance playing piano badly and with great sincerity at 11 o'clock on a Thursday. And she thought about who he had been in Accra and who he was here, and whether those two men bore enough resemblance to each other to be considered the same person. Thought about what Elias had said about his father not knowing the stars. She thought about a man trying. She turned over and stared at the ceiling and refused to let these thoughts take root anywhere important. She was 3 days from Amara's appointment when Mrs. Adiemi found her in the library at 7 in the morning, sitting in the reading chair with a framed school photo of Elias in her hands. She had not heard the housekeeper come in. She put the photo down quickly, but not quickly enough. "Chilled," Mrs. Adiemi said, in a tone Nadia had not heard her use before. Stripped of its professional efficiency, quiet and direct in a way that was either kind or dangerous or possibly both. She closed the library door. She sat across from Nadia in the other reading chair, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at her for a long moment. "Long have you known him?" she asked. Nadia felt the question land somewhere past her defenses. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't," Mrs. Adiemi said, gently but with absolute firmness. "I have worked in this house for 11 years. I have watched men and women deceive and be deceived and perform their performances, and I know." "Nadia, I know what a woman looks like who is carrying something very heavy in a place where no one can see it. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. The library was very quiet. Outside, the October garden was doing its autumn thing, shedding color with a kind of brutal grace. Nadia sat with the framed photo beside her and the portrait above the fireplace visible through the doorway, and felt the first genuine crack run through the wall she'd been maintaining. 8 years ago, she said. Almost 6. She looked at her hands. We were together briefly, in Accra. He was married. I didn't know. Mrs. Adiemi was very still. And then I found out and I ended it. And then, she stopped. And then you discovered you were pregnant, Mrs. Adiemi said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has arrived at the answer through a different route, but arrived nonetheless. Your daughter. Silence. She's his, Nadia said. It was the first time she had said those 2 words to another living person, and they felt enormous in her mouth, like something that had been compressed for years suddenly given room to expand. He doesn't know. He's never known. I decided. She stopped again. I made a decision that I have questioned every day since, and that I still believe was the least damaging available option, and I have lived inside that decision for 6 years. What do you intend to do? The older woman asked. About the truth. About that child who looks at you from a hospital bed with Dominic Vance's eyes. Mrs. Adiemi sat with this information the way she sat with most things, without rushing to a response, giving the weight of it its due. What do you intend to do? I needed this job. I still need it, for 3 more weeks, at minimum. After that I'll find another placement and... That's not what I asked. Nadia looked at her. I asked what you intend to do. About the truth. The older woman's gaze was steady and serious. About that child who looks at you from a hospital bed with Dominic Vance's eyes. About the boy in this house who spent half an hour telling me how interesting it was that the new maid's daughter has the same eyes as him. She paused. He is more perceptive than people give him credit for. He's 7. He is 7, and he is his father's son, which means he notices everything and says nothing and files it away and thinks about it at 11 o'clock in the library with a glass of water and a very still face. Mrs. Adiemi leaned forward slightly. He will figure it out. Perhaps not today, but sooner than you think. Nadia pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Dominic? He hasn't recognized me. A pause. He has been recognized less since Simone. Mrs. Adiemi said carefully. He sees less. It is a kind of damage, I think. The grief took something from him that he hasn't gotten back. She paused. He was not. He is not a bad man, Nadia. He made bad choices before. He has made different choices since. That is not a defense of what he did to you. I want you to see the whole thing. I've seen enough of it.
Nadia said,
And her voice came out with more edge than she intended. Yes, said Mrs. Adiemi, without flinching. I imagine you have. Amara's appointment went well in the careful, conditional way that these appointments went. The specialist was cautiously optimistic. The test results showed stable function. There was a new medication protocol to try, a follow-up in 2 months. Nadia sat beside her daughter in the examination room and watched the doctor talk, and smiled at all the right moments and held Amara's hand and marveled, as she always did in these clinical spaces, at the concentrated force of loving someone this much. At the specific terror of it. Amara was 6 years old and looked at the world with an appetite that was almost aggressive. Hungry for everything, curious about everything, opinionated about most of it. She had Nadia's cheekbones and her grandmother's stubbornness, and an easy confidence that Nadia didn't entirely recognize the origins of, and sometimes envied. She was also, because sick children develop this, finely tuned to the emotional frequency of the adults around her. She knew when her mother was pretending. You're worried, she said in the taxi home, with the directness that Nadia had given up trying to discourage. I'm always a little worried at these appointments, but differently worried. Amara considered this. Where do you work now? A large house?
Tell us you.
Not yet. Why? Because the man who lives there is your father, and I haven't yet decided what to do about that. Because I'm new and I haven't asked permission. She looked at her daughter's profile, the chin tilted up, the eyes moving across the passing city. You'd like the garden, though. Large. Does it have a swing? I look. Amara leaned into her, and Nadia put her arm around the small shoulders and held on with the controlled desperation of someone who understands exactly how much is at stake. She thought about Mrs. Adiemi saying the truth. She thought about Elias, who had looked at a photo of her daughter and identified the eyes. She thought about the piano music she heard sometimes through the ceiling, 3 floors down, at hours when the house was otherwise silent. She thought about the version of this story where she simply left. Took the money she'd saved, found another placement, kept moving. The version where Amara grew up and asked harder questions, and Nadia kept providing the least damaging version of the truth. The version she had been planning for 6 years. She looked at her daughter's face. The version she had been planning felt, in this taxi on this afternoon, suddenly insufficient. Not wrong. She had survived on it, and Amara had survived on it, and there was a kind of pragmatic courage in it that she refused to disavow. But insufficient. Like a structure that had served in an emergency and now needed, eventually, to be replaced by something that could hold more weight. She pressed her lips to the top of Amara's head. Mama? Yes. Are you going to tell me something soon? And Nadia closed her eyes. I don't know yet, she said, which was the most honest thing she could offer. Okay, Amara said, with a tolerance for uncertainty that her daughter had developed from living with a woman who was honest about what she didn't know. I can wait. The confrontation she had been dreading came in the form she least expected, not a dramatic recognition, not a scene, but a question asked in an almost conversational tone by a 7-year-old who had been thinking quietly for 2 weeks. Elias found her in the East Corridor on a Saturday afternoon when the house was mostly empty. Mrs. Adiemi at the market, Dominic at the office. He was carrying a book about constellations that she recognized as one she'd pointed him toward in the library. He stopped in front of her. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. As your daughter's father, my father. The question was stated without drama. In the same tone he used to report facts about the solar system or the properties of different metals. He was watching her with those eyes. His father's eyes, her daughter's eyes, with complete attention. Nadia set down the cleaning supplies she was carrying. She sat on the floor, not because she planned to, but because her legs decided, apparently without consulting her. She sat on the floor of the east corridor and looked up at Elias, who sat down across from her with the unhurried gravity of someone settling in for a serious conversation. "Why do you ask that?" she said. "I looked at your daughter's picture again. You have it as your phone background." He was matter of fact about this. "I know what genetics looks like. I did a project on it in school last year. And I looked at photos of my dad when he was young, and I looked at your daughter." A pause. "I'm not being mean. I'm just trying to understand something." And Nadia looked at this boy, this careful, lonely, extraordinary boy, and felt the distinct sensation of something that had been held under pressure for too long beginning to give way. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since the day I saw the picture, about 12 days. He said this is a simple measurement of time. I don't think my dad knows. He doesn't look at people very carefully anymore." He paused again. "I don't think you came here to make trouble. You don't seem like that." "I didn't," Nadia said, her voice careful and low. "I truly didn't. I needed the work. I didn't know he was your father's employer would be." She stopped. She looked at this boy who was 7 years old and had been carrying a hypothesis for 12 days by himself and had come to her instead of his father. "You're very brave," she said. "I'm scared," he said, with a frankness that almost undid her. "Because if it's true, then I have a sister, and I've always wanted a sister, but it means my dad did something bad, and I don't know how to think about both of those things at the same time. I'm scared. Because if it's true, then I have a sister, and I've always wanted a sister, but it means my dad did something bad. And I don't know how to think about both of those things at the same time." Through a corridor, the Sifatumba light coming through the window and a child's honesty filling the space between them like water filling a room. And she made the decision she had been not making for 6 years, she said. Elias breathed out slowly. "Okay," he said after a moment. "Okay. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that. It's not your secret to carry." "Is it yours?" "It was. Not anymore, I think." She looked at her hands. "I'm going to talk to your father." Elias nodded, very solemnly. "Then, will she have to go to the hospital a lot, your daughter?" Nadia felt a stone drop through her. "You know her name. It's the name on your phone. When you get texts." He was not apologetic about this. "Will she? For a while? She's getting better. I could visit her," he said, "if she wanted. If people in hospitals are allowed to have visitors, I could bring the constellation book." A beat softer. "When I was in hospital last year, I wanted someone to come." The corridor was very quiet. Nadia pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, briefly, and then took a breath and looked at Elias Vance, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a constellation book in his lap and his father's eyes and more grace than most adults she had ever met. "She would love that," she said. She had intended to wait for the right moment, to engineer a careful, private setting, to have her thoughts organized into something that wouldn't come out sideways. She had spent the day rehearsing phrases and discarding them. She had not intended for it to happen the way it happened. She was in the study at 8:45 that evening, returning a book she'd accidentally left on a windowsill when he was already in there. He was sitting at the desk with his jacket off and his shirt sleeves rolled and the particular stillness that meant he'd been sitting for some time without working. The desk lamp made a small warm circle. Everything outside it was the autumn dark of a house settling for the night. He looked up when she entered. "I didn't hear a knock. I'm sorry, It's all right." He gestured vaguely. You're returning the book? I left it to put it on the shelf. She was going to leave. She was fully prepared to leave. I went to Accra, he said, 6 years ago. She stopped with her hand still on the spine of the book. I've been trying to place you, he said, in a tone that had a strange quality, almost remote, like he was describing someone else's experience. Since your second week, there's something in the way you move, the way you... I couldn't access it. I thought it was just that you reminded me of someone. He paused. I went to Accra 6 years ago for a conference. I stayed for 8 months. He stopped. When he continued, his voice had changed, stripped of its professional cadence, carrying something rawer. I was not the man I should have been. Unadia took her hand off the book. There was a woman, he said. I have thought about her. He stopped again. I ended things badly. I disappeared. I told myself at the time that it was for everyone's benefit, and I know now that was cowardice wearing the costume of consideration. He looked at the desk. I have thought about her a great many times since then. Whether she was all right. Whether I owe her. He made a small, frustrated sound. Whether there was something I should have done differently. There was, Nadia said. He looked up. She turned from the bookshelf. In the lamplight, with 6 years between them, and the careful, invisible woman fully set aside, she looked at him directly. There was a great deal you should have done differently. He went very still. She watched the recognition happen, watched it travel across his face like weather moving across a landscape, arriving first in the eyes, then in the set of his jaw, then in the sudden, careful control of everything that was trying to react. He stood up from the desk, not toward her, just up as if he needed to be standing for whatever came next. Nadia, he said. And her name in his voice had the quality of something retrieved from somewhere. It had been kept without light. I didn't come here for this, she said. I want you to know that. I had no idea you lived here. I needed the work and I took the first well-paying position available, and I have spent 5 weeks regretting it and staying anyway, because I need the money and leaving would be worse than. She stopped. She breathed. But there is something you need to know, something that isn't only about what you did to me. The quality of his stillness changed. My daughter, she said. Her name is Amara. She is 6 years old. She has a kidney condition that requires specialist treatment and has since she was 3. She has your eyes and she has no idea why. Because I made a decision 6 years ago to keep her story simple enough to survive, and I have questioned that decision every day since, and I'm done questioning it. She watched him absorb this. She watched a man who had built a second life on the architecture of control receive information that no amount of control could manage, and she watched the control simply fail, not dramatically, not with violence, but with a kind of quiet, total collapse. He sat back down in the desk chair. He put both hands on the desk and looked at them. He said nothing for a very long time. She is mine? He said finally. Not a question, not an accusation. A statement in a new language, working out the grammar of it. Yes, she's been. He looked up. She's been sick. Since she was 3. She's doing better. But it's significant. And you've... His jaw worked. You've been doing this alone for 6 years. He stood up again. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark garden. She could see the shape of something moving through him. Something enormous and slow, the way tectonic plates move. When he turned back, his face had the raw, uncollected look of a man who has been stripped of his professional surface. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. Good, she said. Because I haven't decided yet. Something passed across his face that might, in different circumstances, have been the ghost of a smile. But it was quickly subsumed by something heavier. I want to meet her. I know. She held his gaze. That's not going to happen on your timeline. It's going to happen on hers. And mine. Of course. He said it immediately and without argument, and the immediacy of it, the complete absence of entitled pushback, disarmed her in a way she hadn't expected. She had prepared for negotiation. She had not prepared for simple, immediate deference. She's 6, Nadia said. She doesn't know what I know. I'll tell her in a way she can understand, at a time that's right for her. And then we'll see. We'll see, he repeated, and she understood that he was not protesting or agreeing, but simply receiving the phrase and putting it somewhere. We'll see, as opposed to never or not yet, or it's complicated. We'll see as a beginning rather than a deflection. Elias knows, she said. His head came up sharply. He figured it out. He came to me 2 days ago. He's been thinking about it for nearly 2 weeks. She watched the complicated emotion move through him. The mix of pride in his son's perceptiveness and something like anguish at what the boy had been carrying alone. He handled it extraordinarily well. You should talk to him. I will. He ran a hand across his face. God, a pause. I will. She lay awake until 3 in the morning. This was not unusual. She had lain awake until 3 in the morning on many significant evenings of her life. Her body's way of processing the things her mind had handled in the daytime. She lay in her room on the 3rd floor and listened to the house and thought about the conversation with a clarity that felt almost surgical. He took it apart. She examined each piece. He had not tried to minimize. He had not tried to negotiate. He had not performed contrition. She had seen performed contrition enough to recognize the difference. He had sat in his chair and been absolutely leveled, and then stood up and said the truth as cleanly as he knew how to say it. This did not undo 6 years. It did not undo the 8 months she'd spent building something on a foundation she didn't know was rotten. It did not undo the night she'd sat with Simone Vance's voice in her ear and felt the floor fall away. It did not undo the 3 years she'd had to work extra shifts because Amara's medication was expensive and there was no one to share the weight. But it was something. It was a different shape than she'd expected. She was not going to fall back into this. She needed to hold that firmly. Not because he was a bad man. She was less sure than she had been in her years of quiet anger that he was a bad man. But because trust was a structure that had to be built from scratch. Because she was no longer 26 and susceptible to the particular glamour of chosen attention. Because her job was to protect Amara, and protecting Amara meant being careful. She thought about his son carrying his hypothesis for 12 days and coming to her, instead of in any of the dozens of other directions he could have gone. She thought about a man playing piano badly at 11 at night. She thought about we'll see. She found Dominic in the library at 7 the following morning. He was sitting in the reading chair with a cup of coffee and the specific look of a man who had also not slept. And when she came in with her cleaning materials, he looked up and said, before she could retreat, Elias asked me to bring him to the hospital, when it would be appropriate. She stopped. He told me he talked to you? Dominic continued. He said. He paused and smiled, and the smile was so unexpected and so humanizing that it took her slightly off guard. He said, and I'm quoting directly, died. I think I should be involved in this because I have relevant information and I'm already emotionally invested. He looked at her. He is 7 years old. He's extraordinary, Nadia said. He is. The word was said with a simple, total love that needed no performance. He is the best thing I've ever done. A beat. I know that he needs a sibling. He's been alone in this house with adult grief for 3 years. I've known it and I haven't known what to do with the knowing. She sat across from him, because it seemed like a conversation that should be had sitting down. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything strategic. I have no angle here. I'm just... He looked at his hands. I'm saying I want to get this right. Whatever right looks like. I know I don't have the right to define what right looks like. That's yours to define. And Amara's when she's ready. He looked up. I just wanted you to know that I'm not approaching this as a threat to be managed. I understand that's what I was before. I'm not asking to be trusted. I'm asking for the opportunity to be in a position where trust is eventually possible. Nadia sat with that for a moment. That's a careful distinction, she said. I've had a lot of hours to work it out. She looked at him in the morning light. The controlled man. The one who had built his second life on restraint and professional excellence and parenting from behind a wall of grief. She looked at the portrait above the fireplace, which looked back at her with those eyes that her daughter had inherited. And she thought, he is not a character in the story I've been telling myself. He is a person. He is flawed and real, and there is a 7-year-old in this house who lights up around him, and a 6-year-old in an apartment who has never had that. Her appointment was 3 weeks ago, she said. The next one is in 6 weeks. She's stable now, but the next few months are important. She looked at him directly. If there's going to be any kind of relationship, I need it to be consistent. I need her not to have a father who shows up and then disappears because it becomes complicated. If you enter her life, you stay. Those are my terms and they're non-negotiable. Understood, he said. I'm serious. I know. He held her gaze. Nadia. She breathed out. Then, we'll see. The crisis arrived 10 days later, and it arrived as real crises tend to, at the worst possible time, and in a form no one had imagined. Amara's condition had been stable. The specialist had said stable. And so when Nadia's phone rang at 11:45 on a Tuesday morning with the name of the hospital on the screen, her body understood what it meant before her mind caught up. Amara had been staying with Nadia's neighbor while Nadia worked. The neighbor had called the ambulance. Amara was in the emergency ward with acute kidney inflammation and required immediate intervention, and could someone please come? Nadia was at the estate on the upper floor, and her hands were shaking before she had ended the call, and she was moving before she had thought about moving, through the corridor and down the stairs and reaching for her bag and her keys, and the mathematics of the situation was not working. She needed to be at the hospital car, and the house was in Ridgewood, which were 40 minutes to hospital by taxi if traffic was kind, and traffic was never kind at midday, and Kamenik was coming up the front steps when she came through the door. Through the door. He saw her face and stopped. She told him in 6 words. She watched him take the 6 words in and put down his briefcase and not ask any questions. Just said, my car. Now. And it was not commanding. It was not the voice that ran board meetings and negotiated acquisitions. It was simply the voice of a person who had decided, without deliberation, that the only thing that mattered in this moment was getting her to her daughter. He drove at a speed that was technically reckless and practically necessary, and he did not speak unless she needed him to speak. And when she called the hospital to get an update and her voice broke on the word daughter, he handed her his water bottle without taking his eyes off the road. She drank and stared through the windshield and tried to remember the breathing technique the therapist had taught her 3 years ago, the one specifically for medical crises, and could not quite access it. She's going to be all right, he said. You don't know that, he said. But she has your stubbornness. That's enough. She looked at him. His eyes were on the road. His jaw was set and his hands were steady on the wheel, and there was something in his face that she recognized as terror. Controlled, functional terror, the terror of a man who had already lost one person and was operating in its shadow. He was afraid too. Not for himself, for Amara. For a child he had never met who was nonetheless his, and who was sick in a hospital bed 40 minutes away. The knowledge of that settled into Nadia with unexpected weight. Amara was in a room on the 3rd floor when they arrived. She was conscious. That was the first thing Nadia saw, that her daughter was awake. And the specific physical quality of relief that produced was like a decompression, like a held note finally released. She went to the bedside and held Amara's face in both hands, and Amara said, with her characteristic directness, and Nadia said, "Me too." And for a moment the room contained only that. Then Amara looked past her mother. Dominic was in the doorway. He had stopped there instinctively, not entering, not retreating, understanding without being told that this was the edge of a space that was not his to enter uninvited. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and looking at Amara with an expression that had been stripped entirely of the layered professional control and was simply open. Open and overwhelmed, and trying very hard to hold that quietly. Amara looked at him for a long moment. "Who is that?" she asked. "Someone I work with," Nadia said, looking at Dominic over her shoulder. There was a pause. Then Dominic stepped forward. He stopped at a respectful distance from the bed. He looked at Amara, the braids coming loose, the IV line, the eyes that were his eyes in the face that was her mother's. He went very still for a moment. "My name is Dominic," he said. "I'm glad you're all right. I wasn't really," Amara told him with medical precision. "My kidney had a crisis. But the doctor says it's manageable." She studied him with the frank assessment that was so specifically hers. "You have the same eyes as me." And Nadia's breath caught. Dominic said very quietly, "Yes. I noticed that too." Amara considered him for another moment. With the focused intelligence of a child who has spent her short life in hospitals and learned to read the difference between people who were uncomfortable around her and people who weren't. "You can sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair beside the bed with the magnanimous authority of someone in their own space. He sat down. They sat across from each other, this man and this child who shared blood and nothing else. And Nadia stood at the foot of the bed and watched and felt something that had been held in suspension for 6 years begin very slowly to move. She told Amara 3 days later, when her daughter was home and on the mend and sitting up in bed with her constellation book, which Elias had indeed sent, with a handwritten note that said, "I heard you like stars, and I know most of them," signed with his name and a small drawing of Orion. Amara had read the note 4 times and asked who Elias was and whether she would be allowed to meet him. Nadia sat on the edge of her daughter's bed and told her the truth. She told it in the way she had been thinking about for years. Carefully, clearly, without bitterness, without revision. She said, "Your father is a man named Dominic. She said we were together before you were born, and I made a decision not to tell him about you because of complicated adult things that I will explain better when you are older." She said, "He didn't know you existed." She said, "He knows now." She said, "He wants to meet you properly, if you want that." She said, "There is nothing wrong with you. There is nothing about this that is your fault. You have always been completely and entirely wanted." Amara sat through this with her serious eyes and the slightly, too still expression that meant she was processing something at a depth that would only become visible later. "Is he a good person? I think he's trying to be," Nadia said honestly. "Trying is enough," Amara said, with the pragmatic grace of a child who has spent significant time around doctors and learned to be realistic about progress. "Is it enough for you?" Amara looked at the note from Elias. "He has a son," she said. "Yes. And the son sent me a book about stars." "Yes. And the father drives fast and has my eyes." She paused. "And you brought him to the hospital." I didn't. He drove me. Because I needed to get to you. Amara turned this over. She said finally, I want to meet him. Properly? A beat. Can I also meet Elias? Yes. Good. She settled back into her pillows. Tell him I already know Orion. The meeting was organized with care, the kind of care that Nadia had learned to take around fragile things. The care of someone who understands that the most important structures are the ones you build slowly, checking each piece before you add the next. She chose a neutral place, a park in Ikoyi, wide and green and populated with other families who would provide the normalizing backdrop of ordinary life. She chose a Saturday. She did not ask Dominic to bring gifts or prepare speeches. She simply said, be yourself. Let her be herself. Follow her lead. He arrived before them. She sought him from across the park. Standing near a large acacia tree with his hands in the pockets of a jacket that was less formal than anything she'd seen him wear before, watching the gate through which they would come. He had Elias with him. Elias was carrying the constellation book. Amara spotted them from 20 meters out and stopped walking. Nadia crouched beside her. Ready? He looks nervous, Amara said, with the clinical observation she applied to all things. He is. Good, she said, without malice, simply as a piece of information. Started walking again. What happened next was one of those moments that doesn't resolve into narrative easily. It's too small and too enormous at the same time. The particular quality of an event that is simultaneously ordinary and irreversible. Dominic saw them coming and unclenched his hands from his pockets. Elias saw Amara and immediately held out the constellation book. Not as an offering exactly, more as an introduction, as if the book could say what he wasn't sure yet how to say in person. Amara looked at Elias. Elias looked at Amara. They had their father's eyes. I know Orion. Amo, he said. Your mum told mine. A pause. Then Amara said, show me something I don't know. Elias opened the book. They walked ahead together, two children with their father's eyes and the small, unself-conscious ease of people who haven't yet learned to be cautious about connection, pointing at diagrams and arguing about pronunciations of star names with the immediate comfortable confidence of people who have found someone operating on the same frequency. Nadia and Dominic followed at a short distance. She told him she already knew Orion, Dominic said. She wanted him to have to work for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she's extraordinary. I know, Nadia said, and the pride in her voice was the kind that has been earning itself for 6 years and doesn't need to perform. They walked for a while in silence that was different from all the previous silences between them. Not tense or cautious or weighted with unresolved things. Just the silence of two people watching their children walk ahead of them through afternoon light, figuring out the grammar of something new. I'm not going to stop working at your house immediately, she said. Mrs. Adayemi would find it suspicious, and I don't want to create more upheaval than necessary, but we need to talk about what the arrangement looks like going forward. Whatever you need it to look like. Dominic. He looked at her. She used his name deliberately, a small signal, a step out of the protective distance of Sir. I mean it, he said. There's no version of this where I try to control what it looks like. You get to define the terms. I get to try to meet them. She looked at him. In the afternoon light, with his son walking ahead of them, he looked less carved down than usual, less sealed. There was something in him that was tentatively alive, or newly available, or returning from somewhere it had been stored. She wasn't sure which metaphor was right. She wasn't sure any metaphor was adequate. Then the terms are you're in this completely or you're not in it at all, she said. No partial commitment. No diplomatic distance. If Amara decides she wants a father, she gets a father who stays. Yes! And you understand that what you did, what you were, I haven't forgiven it. I may. I don't know yet.
I understand.
And this, she gestured at the space between them. This is not. We're not. I'm not walking back into. I know, he said. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to be someone she can count on. He paused. And if, at some point, if you allow, I would like, eventually, to work toward being someone you might trust again, not as an expectation, as a hope. She looked at the children ahead of them. Elias was pointing at something in the sky. Amara was shielding her eyes against the sun, looking up. That's a very careful distinction, she said again. I've had time to think. Yes, she said, and then, because it was honest, so have I. She left the estate 6 weeks later, in the middle of November, with Mrs. Adeyemi overseeing the packing of her room with the watchful efficiency that the older woman brought to all logistical matters. The housekeeper hugged her at the door, a brief, tight embrace that was entirely unexpected and somehow encompassed everything that had passed between them. All the conversations and the silences and the moments of seeing and being seen. You did the harder thing, Mrs. Adeyemi said. I'm not sure which harder thing you mean, Nadia said. All of them, said the older woman, and released her. She moved into a better apartment. Not because of him, though the increase in her savings from the estate placement had helped significantly, because Amara's hospital was nearby, and because she had found a consistent position at a hotel in Victoria Island that paid well and had regular hours, and because she had decided that her life deserved a sturdier foundation than the one she'd been maintaining for years. Because she was 31 years old, and she had done the difficult work of surviving, and it was time, carefully and on her own terms, to try something other than surviving. Dominic sent her a message on the day she moved. Just want you to know I took Elias to the hospital last week. He showed Amara the Andromeda Galaxy, and apparently they argued for 20 minutes about whether light pollution in Lagos is worse than in Accra. He told me it was the best conversation he's had in a year. I believe him. Thank you. She read the message on her new kitchen floor, surrounded by boxes, and wrote back, she told me the same thing. Then Elias is extraordinary. You should tell him that more, he replied. I'm trying to. I'm learning how. She put the phone down and started unpacking books. The months that followed were not a resolution so much as a construction. The slow, tested, gradually reliable building of something that had no good precedent. She and Dominic were not together, and she was not building toward that, and she held that line with the quiet firmness of someone who understands what they owe themselves. But they were in communication, about the children, about schedules, about what Amara needed medically, and what Elias was going through at school, and the careful calibration of how much to tell each child when, and in what terms. Dominic came to the specialist's appointment in January. He sat across from her in the waiting room with 4 feet and a magazine between them, and they both pretended to read, and he handed her coffee when she came back from the reception desk, when the doctor confirmed that Amara's kidney function was improving. Measurably, meaningfully improving. She heard him breathe out beside her and looked over, and his face was doing the thing she'd seen it do the first day in the park open. Unguarded. Simply present with the fact of a child being all right. She did not reach for his hand. But she looked at him, and she let him see her looking. A month later, Amara asked if she could see where Elias lived. She took her on a Saturday morning. Dominic met them at the gate and showed Amara the garden, which did have a swing, set in the back corner under a mango tree, that had apparently never been used since Simone's death. Elias had asked his father to oil it. It worked perfectly. Amara swung for 45 minutes while Elias pushed her and lectured her about momentum, and Nadia sat on the garden bench, and Dominic sat beside her, and they watched their children in the afternoon light and said very little and needed to say very little. "She has your laugh," he said. "She has your stubbornness." "I thought you said that was yours. We can share it." He was quiet for a moment. She felt the warmth of him beside her on the bench and allowed herself to feel it without making a decision about it, which was a new skill she was developing. The ability to receive good things without immediately categorizing them. "I owe you more than I can articulate," he said. "You owe me consistency," she said. "That's the whole debt. Show up. Keep showing up. That pays it. I'm going to." "I know," she said, and she found, to her own surprise, that she did. In April, 6 months after she had first stood in the foyer of the Vance estate and pressed the buzzer and told herself it was just a house, Amara asked Nadia a question at breakfast. "If Dominic is my dad," she said, with the directness she applied to all things, "and Elias is his son, then is Elias my brother?" Nadia set down her tea.
Half-brother.
Yes. Amara considered this with the gravity she brought to important classifications. "Is that less or more than a regular brother?" "Some people say less, but it depends on the people." "It doesn't feel less," Amara said. "When he pushes me on the swing, he pushes me at the exact right speed, which most people don't." She took a bite of toast. "And he knows more stars than me, which is annoying but also useful." "That sounds more," Nadia agreed. "Yeah." Amara ate her toast. "Will you marry Dominic?" Nadia nearly choked on her tea. We're not. That's not something I've... Looks at you differently than he looks at other people," Amara said, with the clinical observation that had been humbling her mother since approximately age 3. "I noticed. Elias noticed too. He told me his dad looks at you like he's trying to remember something, but also like he already knows it." Nadia sat with this for a moment. She thought about a man playing piano badly at 11 at night. She thought about 4 feet and a magazine in a hospital waiting room. She thought about a bench in the garden and the sound of a swing and the afternoon light working through the mango leaves. She thought about trust as a structure you build from scratch. "We'll see," she told her daughter. Amara accepted this with her characteristic pragmatism. "Okay, can I have more toast?" he asked her in May. Not formally, not on one knee with a ring, which was not who either of them were. He asked her on the back terrace of his house after a dinner where both children had fallen asleep in front of a film and been carried, snoring, to their beds. They were sitting in the May dark with the warm season beginning to breathe its way into the night, and the city laid out below the ridge in its thousands of lights, and he turned to her and said, "I want to ask you something." "All right." Not as a negotiation, not as a transaction, not as something you have to answer today. He was looking at her with complete attention, the particular quality of attention she had recognized a long time ago in a hotel bar in Accra, but different now. Older, cleared of its ambiguity, stripped of its performance. Just present. "Then ask," she said. "Do you think, at some point, there might be room for us? For this to be us, not because of the children, because of what I think we could be, given the chance." He paused. "I have thought about that differently every day for 30 years, and I think it looks like you. I think it has always looked like you, and I was too much of a coward to build toward it when I had the chance." He looked at his hands. "I'm trying not to be a coward anymore." She sat in the Maid dark. She thought about 26 and the waterfront in Accra and the specific gravity of being truly seen by someone for the first time. She thought about Simone Vance's tired voice on the phone. She thought about 6 years of not looking and surviving and building a floor out of her own, well, because no other floor was offered. She thought about Amara saying trying is enough. She thought about what enough looked like when enough was genuine. "Not today," she said. "Not this month." She looked at him in the dark. But maybe? It's possible that one day the answer is yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is that a we'll see? It's a better than we'll see, she said. Something crossed his face. That expression she had noted before. The one that was the ghost of a smile but had grown, in these past months, into something less haunted. He looked at the city lights and then at her and said, with a quietness that was simply true, "That's enough." On the first evening in June, the four of them drove out to a headland north of Lagos, where the light pollution was thinner and the stars came in with more authority. Elias had planned the route on a map. Amara had brought the constellation book. They spread a blanket on the grass and lay on their backs, and the children began to argue, in the affectionate, combative way of their newly minted sibling relationship, about the proper boundaries of Scorpius. Nadia lay on her back and looked up and felt the particular vastness of a sky that is simply being a sky, not symbolic, not meaningful in the way it would be in a story. Just genuinely enormous and indifferent and full of light that had been traveling for longer than any of them could imagine. Dominic lay beside her. Not touching, there was still the careful distance between them. The distance that was not coldness, but the measured space of something being built correctly. She could feel the warmth of him there, the solid fact of him. "Andromeda," Amara announced, pointing. "Why found it?" "I found it," Elias said. "You confirmed it. That's finding it together," Amara told him, in the tone of someone closing a debate. Nadia smiled up at the dark. From beside her, "She's yours," Dominic said quietly. "And yours?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you for that." She didn't need to ask what he meant. She understood it the way she understood the stars. Not by naming every individual thing, but by seeing the whole shape of it. "Thank you for keeping her. Thank you for bringing her here. Thank you for having the courage I didn't." She turned her head and looked at him, looking up at the sky, and allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to look at him without armor. "Just look. Ask me again in the autumn," she said. He turned his head. Their eyes met in the dark, and the quality of that meeting, held, unhurried, clear, was the answer to about 800 hours of questions that neither of them had been ready to ask. "In the autumn," he said. "The children were arguing again about whether you could use Orion's belt to find the North Star. And the stars were making their ancient indifferent light, and the blanket was warm under 4 different heartbeats, and the city glowed at the edge of the dark like something just beginning."